A few weeks ago, I received an email from a viewer. The subject line read, "Please look into the death of a local millionaire." Intrigued, I clicked on the email and began reading. What I learned would shock me. Here's what the email said. On December 27, 2019, 81-year-old Helen Viola was discovered dead inside her mansion in the early morning hours by her son. When officers arrived at the scene, they noticed that all the doors inside the home were locked from the outside, which led them to believe that Helen had locked herself inside her room before passing away. However, an autopsy revealed that she had actually been poisoned. Who could have done such a thing? And how could they have gotten away with it for so long? Let's take a closer look at this strange case. Helen Viola was born on June 4, 1938, in Brooklyn, New York. She grew up living the life of privilege, thanks to her father, Dominic. You see, Dominic made his money by bootlegging alcohol during the days of Al Capone. As soon as Prohibition was repealed, he got out of the business and began investing. By the time he passed away, he built quite the empire. When Helen's mother died too, she inherited her father's fortune and became one of the wealthiest women in the United States. In 1998, Helen moved to Saddle River, New Jersey, where she purchased a sprawling $6 million mansion. Over the years, she became well known in the neighborhood for being extremely private and rarely leaving her house. She did, however, love to drive around the area in her silver Rolls-Royce Phantom. Helen was also a bit of a hoarder and kept to herself most of the time. It got so bad that at one point she had to hire a team of 20 people to clean out her garage. But despite having more than enough money to pay for help, she did most things around the house herself. She even mowed her own lawn. Helen was also quite the animal rights activist and frequently donated to animal welfare organizations. In addition to this, she never married. But she did have 2 children from a previous relationship, a daughter named Michelle and a son named Paul. Though she certainly could have afforded to send them to private school, Helen chose to have them attend public schools instead. She also didn't push them to pursue any particular career paths and simply let them make their own choices. Because of this, both of her children became successful in their chosen fields. Michelle went on to become a registered nurse and Paul became a builder. But despite being rich, Helen knew that her children would only try to take advantage of her for her money. So she set up a trust fund for them that paid them a monthly allowance. This way, they would always have some extra spending money, but they wouldn't be able to drain her bank account all at once. For the most part, Helen seemed to be content with her life, but everything changed when she met Joseph. We don't know much about Joseph because Helen was so private about her personal life. However, we do know that he was almost 20 years her junior. He also worked as a handyman, which might have piqued Helen's interest because she liked doing home improvement projects. At first, her friends and family thought that Joseph was just a friend. But over time, they realized that something romantic was going on between the two of them. In fact, there were several photos taken of them by neighbors that showed them holding hands and embracing. Though Helen was happy with Joseph, her children weren't so sure about him. They began telling her that he was only after her money and suggested that she break up with him. But Helen brushed off their concerns, believing that they were wrong. Sadly, though, her children were right. And while it may seem obvious now, Helen didn't see it at the time. Years passed, and Helen continued seeing Joseph. Then, in late 2019, she suffered a stroke, which left her partially paralyzed. After the stroke, she had to move into a care home where she lived until her death on December 27, 2019. Her son, Paul, visited her every day at the care home and stayed with her through the night before her passing. In fact, he was with her when she passed away in her sleep. Because Helen had no known health problems other than the lingering effects of her stroke, the staff at the care home wasn't overly concerned. They simply assumed that she passed away of natural causes. However, an autopsy revealed that she'd actually been poisoned by antifreeze. But how could this have happened? Antifreeze is tasteless and odorless, making it easy to slip into food or drink without anyone noticing. And since Helen was bedridden, it's possible that someone had snuck it into her Ensure or feeding tube. Police interviewed the staff members at the care home, but none of them admitted to poisoning Helen or knew who could have done such a thing. They then turned their attention to Paul. During an interview with police, Paul claimed that he hadn't seen or heard anything suspicious. However, he did admit to being angry at his mother for not leaving him more money in her will. Police searched his house and uncovered some evidence that tied him directly to his mother's murder. You see, the authorities found a receipt for the purchase of windshield antifreeze, which was dated 3 days prior to Helen's death. The receipt was printed off of Paul's computer and bore his name and address. They also found traces of antifreeze in the garage of his house. But perhaps the most damning piece of evidence was the security footage from the gas station where the antifreeze had been bought. It showed Paul purchasing the antifreeze himself. With this evidence against him, Paul was arrested and charged with his mother's murder. During his trial, prosecutors argued that Paul killed his mother out of greed. They reminded the jury of the fact that Paul had admitted to getting angry over the contents of Helen S. will and pointed out that he stood to gain a significant amount of money from her life insurance policy. Prosecutors also brought up the fact that Paul had a history of abusing his mother, which added credibility to the theory that he was capable of murdering her. Paul's defense attorney argued that there was no concrete evidence that Paul had poisoned Helen, only circumstantial evidence. While it's true that Paul did buy the antifreeze, he claims that it was to clean the engine of his car. To support this claim, he took the stand and testified that he used the antifreeze in his car. However, the prosecution pointed out that the receipts showed that he bought far more antifreeze than his car would hold, proving that he lied. On May 21, 2021, after deliberating for only 2 hours, the jury found Paul guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. As for Joseph, he was charged in connection to Helen S.'s death because he had passed away in 2018. But let's just say he definitely didn't get away scot-free. When news broke that Helen had been murdered, many of her neighbors came forward and said that they suspected Joseph had something to do with her death. One neighbor even told the media that she saw Joseph entering and exiting Helen S.'s home multiple times during the months leading up to her death. Unfortunately for Joseph, he couldn't be brought to justice because he'd already passed away. It appears that Helen was completely unaware that those around her, including her own son, were looking to take advantage of her. We'll probably never know exactly why Paul decided to kill his mother. But what we do know is that he is already in prison and won't be getting out anytime soon. Now check out Evil Stepmother Locks Up Daughter's Room. Then Evil Plan Unfolds. Or watch Heiress Left No Money for Son, so he did the unthinkable.